Hi guys, tonight, if you are listening to this when the room has grown quiet, when the light has softened and the outside world is no longer demanding your attention, try to imagine something very simple. Imagine an ordinary morning, no warning signs, no thunder, no blood-red sky, no prophecy spoken aloud. Just a morning when everything begins to slip just a little. The temperature is lower than usual. The wind blows from a different direction. The herds do not appear where they always have, and these small signs at that time are not large enough to be called a catastrophe. For most of human history, we did not live with the idea that everything could end all at once. The land was still there. The water was still there. The sky still moved according to familiar rhythms. Season followed season, year followed year, slowly enough that people believed tomorrow would always resemble today, only slightly different. And there was no language to describe a collapse on a global scale. Because humanity's first global catastrophe did not happen in a single moment, had no center, and no clear beginning date. It was more like the quiet shifting of the world's order. And when that order disappeared, everything was still there. It simply no longer functioned the way it used to. People continued to live, continued to move, continued to hunt, continued to have children. But little by little, they stepped out of a familiar world without realizing that they would never be able to return to it. No historian recorded that moment. No stone tablet carved the words, "This is where everything began to collapse." Because at that time, history did not yet exist. And for that very reason, this catastrophe was not remembered as a catastrophe. It existed only as a very deep void in humanity's memory, a void that later on we would try to fill with mythology, with legend, with stories of a time before. But behind all of those stories lies a very cold truth. There was a moment when humanity came very close to disappearing completely, not because of war, not because of technology, not because of a visible enemy, but because the earth changed its state, and humanity at that time was only a small creature trying to learn how to exist in a world that no longer favored it. Tonight's story is not a story about destruction. It is a story about survival, about people who did not know they were living through the most dangerous moment in human history, about small decisions repeated again and again that kept the human line from breaking, and about a collective memory that was buried, not because it was forbidden, but because no one had the means to remember it. The world before the catastrophe was a world familiar enough for people to believe it would continue existing that way for a very long time. Temperature rose and fell with the seasons, not with perfect precision, but with enough regularity for the human body to learn its rhythm without measuring. Cold did not arrive like a sudden blow. It returned like a familiar visitor, long known, expected long enough for people to prepare, gather animal skins, move toward lower ground, seek places with less wind and longer sunlight across the day. Heat did not scorch in silence either. It slowly occupied the living space, forcing people to adjust their hours, find shade, reduce movement, and learn to conserve their own energy. Over many generations, the human body became a tool for remembering climate, responding to environmental change before the mind could even name it. Rain came and went without a fixed schedule, but often enough to create memory. Showers softened the earth, left behind the familiar scent of dampness, and turned barren land into places worth returning to. After rain grass rose, footprints became clearer, and the well-known muddy paths became signals water had been here, and it would return. People learned to read soil, read clouds, and sense moisture in the wind through senses sharpened by time without explanation, without theory, without a system. Animals appeared in places familiar across generations, not because they were bound there, but because when an ecosystem remained stable, It creates its own loops. Herds return to old valleys. Migration routes repeated long enough to become collective knowledge. People did not need maps. They carried small signs in memory, a slanted cliff, a bend in the river, a strip of grass lower than the surrounding ground. These signs were never formally named, but they were trusted because they had been right for longer than a single lifetime. Water rose and withdrew not hurriedly, not violently, but slowly enough that its rhythm could be learned by observation alone. It left marks on stone, on earthen banks, on tree trunks, and those marks did not vanish at once. People looked at them to decide whether to stay or leave, to move forward or wait. Not every decision was correct, but enough were correct for them to continue existing, and more importantly, to believe that this world could still be understood. People did not live in absolute safety. Life was still harsh, and death was not unfamiliar. It appeared in small accidents, a fall, a wound that turned infected, a cold night that lasted longer than expected. Illness had no formal names, but it had familiar shapes: fever, exhaustion, and quiet disappearance. Predators were not monsters. They were part of the world like people, and unwanted encounters left behind, memory passed down, not through long stories, but through avoidance, through caution, through behavior. Hunger did not arrive like a sudden strike. It came as prolonged shortage. Meals became smaller, the distance between successful hunts stretched wider, and the human body learned to endure before the mind could even respond. Yet even then, people did not think the world was abandoning them. They believed they were living through a difficult period, like the difficult periods that had occurred before. In their lived experience, the world had never vanished completely. It only narrowed, and then opened again. That experience formed a quiet belief that nature could be harsh but not treacherous, that after hardship, a new balance would always come. This belief was not superstition. It was a reasonable conclusion drawn from thousands of days in a world where order, though fragile, still existed. And for that very reason, when that order began to withdraw in a way without precedent, people had no mental tools to recognize what was happening, not because they had become worse observers, but because what they saw still resembled the old world, only a little less generous. But because those dangers were always local and happened within a range the mind could imagine, people had no reason to think the entire system could collapse all at once. A group might die in drought, a region might be swept by flood, a herd might vanish from a familiar valley. But the world as a whole was still there. The sky still moved, the ground still endured, the seasons still turned. And that repetition created a powerful feeling, even though it was never spoken aloud, that the order of the world was self-evident. People of that time had no concept of global climate, no temperature charts, no data accumulated across tens of thousands of years. They had only lived memory what they themselves had experienced, and the stories passed down from the generation before. And within that memory, the world always seemed stable. Not stable in the sense of comfort, but stable in the sense that one could learn how to live with it. If winter grew colder, people learned to move earlier. If the dry season lasted longer, they learned to store more. If a land no longer suited them, they left. These adjustments happened slowly, step by step, and therefore did not create the feeling that the world was changing its nature. Change, when slow enough, is not felt as a threat. It is felt as life itself. And this was the most dangerous thing about the world before the catastrophe. Not because people were naive, not because they lacked intelligence, but because their lived experience offered no precedent for a systemic collapse. For most of human existence, nature could be harsh, but it did not behave erratically. It caused harm sometimes brutally, but according to patterns stable enough for people to learn how to live alongside them. Major climate shifts rarely unfolded within the span of a single lifetime. They spread so slowly that no individual could fully sense their beginning or their end. A person was born into one kind of world, grew up in a world nearly the same, and died without ever witnessing the total breakdown of the conditions that had sustained them. That distance in time blurred the boundary between true change and temporary fluctuation. A colder than usual year was easily understood as an exception. A prolonged drought was seen as a trial that would eventually pass. Even the clearest changes were often placed within the same familiar frame. The world is adjusting, and after every hard period, a new balance will appear. When change cannot be fully felt within a single lifetime, it is very difficult to recognize it as an existential threat. From that emerged a very durable illusion, not an illusion of safety, but an illusion of tempo. People believed the world could change, but would never change quickly enough to break the entire way they lived. That every shift, however large, would unfold slowly enough for people to adapt, to adjust, to find a different way of existing before everything became irreversible. That illusion did not come from subjectivity or ignorance, but from the silent statistics of life itself. A human lifetime looked back upon is a chain of days in which the world continued to function. The sun still rose, night still fell, the ground still endured human footsteps. When something remains true for decades in a row, it is no longer felt as an assumption that needs testing. It becomes an invisible foundation beneath every other decision. People did not need to tell each other that climate would remain stable. They lived as though it were self-evident. And because their lived experience contained no precedent for total collapse, that possibility had almost no clear place in thought. In their perception, the world could shrink, become harsher, force them to move, but it would never vanish completely. The difference between a world that is harder to live in and a world that has changed its state is subtle, and for most of the time, people had no reason to believe they were approaching the second boundary. So when changes began to stack, when what had been temporary stopped reversing, when familiar loops no longer closed as they used to, people still interpreted everything in the language of the old world. They believed they were living through a prolonged, hard period, not standing inside a state shift from which the entire system would never return to its original shape. And it was in that gap between the speed of the world's change and the speed at which humans could recognize it that humanity's first global catastrophe began to take form. Not as a sudden collapse, but as a long slide almost impossible to feel for those living inside it. A person is born, grows up, ages, and dies within the same kind of world. Their children live in a similar world. And when something has been true for 3 or 4 generations in a row, it is no longer treated as an assumption. It becomes a foundation. The world before the catastrophe was a world in which humans had begun to form more stable relationships with their surrounding environment. Not control, not conquest, but a gradual familiarity built through repetition. Familiar paths formed not because they were the best roads, but because they had been walked enough times without disaster. Hunting grounds were remembered not because they were always abundant, but because they had sustained people in the past. Shelters were revisited not because they were perfect, but because they had protected life through difficult seasons. That repetition did not create absolute safety, but it created something subtler, the feeling that this world could be trusted. When a person returns to the same place through many cycles, through wet season, and dry through good years and harsh ones, that place slowly loses its sense of being temporary. It becomes part of life, a fixed point in the mind's map. A place returned to often enough is no longer felt as a temporary refuge. It begins to resemble home, not in architecture, but in psychology. Home is where people know in advance what they will find, where water is, which way the wind blows when sunlight arrives during the day. Home is where risks do not disappear, but have been identified. And when a risk can be named, it no longer feels like absolute fear. That idea of home shows the degree of trust people placed in the world around them. No one calls a place home if they believe it could vanish completely tomorrow. This concept did not appear in a single moment, but through hundreds, thousands of small decisions, stay one more season, return, one more year, place trust in loops that had once been true. Each return without catastrophe quietly reinforced that trust, even if no one was fully conscious of it. And from those unnamed homes, people began to live as though the world possessed a level of stability large enough to rely on. Not to dream far ahead, not to build for centuries to come, but to believe that tomorrow would still exist within the same frame. That was not naivete. It was a reasonable conclusion drawn from lived experience. But that conclusion also tied humans more deeply to the familiar structure of the world, deeply enough that when that structure began to crack, change became harder to recognize. No one calls a place home if they believe it could vanish completely tomorrow. People of that time did not think of the future in a distant sense. They did not plan for hundreds of years. They did not build for generations not yet born. But neither did they live as people always ready to flee. Between those two extremes, they found a fragile balance, stay long enough in one place to understand it, but always keep the ability to leave if necessary. That balance worked for a very long time. And precisely because it worked, no one questioned whether it could fail. Humanity's first global catastrophe did not begin with panic. It began in normalcy, a season slightly colder, a year drier, a herd arriving later. Those signs were not abnormal enough to break the belief that everything would adjust on its own. People were used to adapting. They believed this time would be the same, and in some sense, they were right. They adapted, just not fast enough for the speed at which the world was changing. What is remarkable is not that people noticed no change. They noticed it, but they understood those changes in the old way as temporary fluctuations, as familiar trials that the world sometimes imposed. No one could imagine that these small adjustments were the surface expression of a much deeper shift, a shift that could not be fixed simply by moving one more valley or changing hunting strategy. At that time, people still believed the order of the world was something to rely on, and that belief, reasonable in their context, was precisely what made the catastrophe more dangerous. Because catastrophe did not arrive as a clear invader. It arrived as a slow withdrawal of the conditions that had supported life. No alarm bells, no decisive moment. Only a world becoming less and less like the world humans had learned to survive within. And when people began to realize that familiar adjustments were no longer enough, they were already standing very close to a boundary that had never existed in their imagination before, the boundary between a world that can be adapted to and a world that has changed its state. In the next chapter, we will look at the moment when that boundary began to take shape, not as an instant collapse, but as a silent pressure, accumulating until the entire system could no longer maintain its old form. The climate shock did not arrive as a named event. It did not appear on a specific day, and it had no clear boundary separating before from after. For the people living inside it, that shock did not take the shape of an incident. It was closer to a prolonged sensation, the sense that the world was becoming harder to predict, even though everything familiar still seemed to be there. The earth never stops moving. its climate has never been still. But for most of human history, those movements unfolded slowly enough to be absorbed into daily life. People might not have understood why this winter was colder than the last, or why the rains came later than collective memory expected, but they were used to treating such deviations as temporary. In their lived experience, the world always seemed to drift back toward some kind of balance. What made this period different was not the level of harshness, but the nature of the change itself. The Earth was no longer merely oscillating around an old point of balance. It began to move away from that point, and that departure happened in a way that was almost impossible to feel in the short term. Yet, it produced cumulative consequences that people only recognized when it was too late. The earliest signs of climate shock did not look like disaster. They appeared as small disruptions in the loops that had once been trusted. A cold season lasting a little longer. A warming phase that did not bring recovery the way it used to. Rains arriving off rhythm, or falling in places that had rarely received them before. All of these taken separately were not severe enough to change how people understood the world. But when those small disruptions began to stack, they were no longer exceptions. They became signs of a system operating under a new logic. And what is striking is that this new logic was not chaotic. It was simply different. That subtle difference is exactly what made it dangerous. Climate began to fluctuate in cycles that were no longer familiar. These shifts were not merely hotter or colder, but changes in how energy was distributed across the entire planet. Regions that had once been stable became unpredictable. Areas that had once been resilient began to lose their elasticity. Ecosystems built on repetition started to struggle to renew themselves. For humans, these changes were felt first through absence. Herds no longer appeared at the expected time. Lands that had supported hunting and gathering for many seasons in a row began to deplete more quickly. Water was still there, but it was no longer reliable. It arrived when it was not needed and withdrew when people depended on it the most. And yet at this stage, people still believed they were facing a sequence of hard years, not a state shift of the entire planet. They adjusted their behavior in the ways that had worked before, moving earlier, going farther, splitting into smaller groups to reduce pressure on resources. For a time, these strategies still kept them alive. That very ability to adapt delayed recognition of how serious the climate shock truly was. Because as long as people were still surviving, they had no reason to believe they were standing before a limit that had never existed before. Adaptation is life's natural reflex. And when adaptation still works, danger never appears as something self-evident. But the difference between a world that is fluctuating and a world that has changed its state is this: in the second world, every adjustment is only a delay. It cannot restore what has been lost. And with every successful delay, people believed even more strongly that they were moving in the right direction. So, the climate shock did not cause an immediate collapse. It thinned the safety margins of life. Mistakes that once could be compensated for became more dangerous. Bad seasons followed one another without good seasons strong enough to balance them out again. Ecosystems that once recovered quickly began to weaken, and as recovery slowed, pressure accumulated more and more. On the individual level, no one witnessed this entire process because no one lived long enough to see the world move from stability to complete exhaustion. A person could only compare their present to the near past, to childhood years, to how their parents had lived, to what had once been considered normal. And in that comparison, change rarely appeared as a rupture. It appeared as a slight difference. Their world was a little harder than their parents' world, and perhaps their children's world would be harder by another small step. Because change unfolded in such small increments, it did not trigger urgency. There was no moment when an individual could say, "From here on, everything has completely changed." Instead, there was a chain of quiet adjustments, having to travel farther to hunt, having to move more often, having to accept a lower standard of living than what had once been familiar. Each adjustment taken alone seemed reasonable, and because it was reasonable, no one had reason to doubt the entire system on which they relied. On the community level, awareness was not much broader. A group might recognize that what had once been normal now required more effort, but they could not know that the same thing was happening far away in different forms with the same deep cause. There was no way to connect those scattered experiences into a complete picture. No climate maps, no accumulated data sets, no collective memory long enough to recognize that these were no longer repeating hardships, but a new direction of the world. That limitation of vision made the climate shock especially dangerous. It did not strike humans with intensity, but with fragmentation. Each person saw only a small portion of the problem. Each community faced only a local version of scarcity, and because no one saw the whole, no one could name what was happening. The non-synchronous nature of the climate shock deepened that uncertainty even further. The Earth did not change state everywhere at once. In some regions, conditions remained good enough to sustain familiar life. In others, shortage became permanent, forcing people to leave. That very contrast created the illusion that the problem was merely local, that if one place became unlivable, another place could still receive those who fled. So, people moved from less stable regions toward more stable ones, carrying the pressure of survival with them. But that pressure did not disappear when they left. It was transferred. Lands that had once been able to sustain small communities now had to absorb new demands. Resources were consumed faster. Recovery loops were shortened, and places that had once been anchors gradually became points of tension. The danger lay in this: throughout the entire process, there were always regions that were still okay. Their existence delayed recognition of how severe the climate shock truly was. As long as there was still somewhere to go, people believed the world still had room. As long as there were communities that could still live, total collapse remained a concept too abstract to feel real. But as non-synchronicity narrowed, when more and more regions entered prolonged scarcity, and even the places that had once been stable began to lose their ability to recover, the world no longer had enough space to absorb pressure. Only then did people begin to realize that they were not merely moving through a world that was harder to live in. They were living in a world that had changed its state. And when they realized that they were already standing very close to another threshold, a threshold beyond which survival was no longer something that could be quietly assumed, but became an open question applied to the entire species. Regions that had served as anchors began to bear pressure beyond their ability to recover. Resources could not regenerate in time. The loops that had once sustained life stretched, then broke. Yet even then, the world still did not collapse in a way that could be clearly seen. It simply became less forgiving of mistakes. People began to spend more energy to maintain the same minimal level of life. Hunts grew longer, but yielded less. Movements became more frequent, but did not bring lasting stability. When the energy gained no longer covered, the energy spent life did not end immediately. It weakened little by little. By this stage, the climate shock had completed its role. The Earth had changed its state. But humans were still living by the interpretive frames of the old world. They continued to believe that if they adjusted enough, if they stayed flexible enough, if they moved far enough, the familiar loops would return. Climate change at that time did not take the shape of an instant fury. It resembled a prolonged desynchronization of the natural world. Seasons that had once followed one another with enough regularity to rely on began to slip out of their familiar orbit. Cold arrived earlier, but did not withdraw on time, leaving extended transition periods when the land had not yet revived, but frost returned. Elsewhere, warmth lingered longer than normal, draining moisture from the soil before rain could arrive, pushing vegetation into cycles of decline without a clear phase of recovery. Rain did not disappear completely, but it became unpredictable. There were years when water fell violently in short bursts, flooding over hardened ground, and then retreating quickly without soaking deeply enough to nourish roots. In other stretches, rain thinned until rivers and streams dropped, revealing rocky banks never seen in living memory. Water still existed, but it was no longer in the right places at the right times to sustain the loops that had once fed ecosystems. Winds shifted direction more often, carrying unfamiliar air masses. Regions once sheltered from cold began to endure prolonged deep freezes. Places once mild became harsher in short periods that repeated again and again, enough to disrupt plant growth cycles and animal migrations. These changes did not destroy the world in a single moment, but they weakened its ability to self-correct little by little. Ecosystems responded not with sudden collapse, but with slowing. Plants grew more slowly. Animals reproduced less. Links that had once closed within the food chain began to stretch. And when an ecosystem slows, every creature that depends on it must spend more energy to survive in the same space. For humans, climate change was not felt as an abstract concept, but as a prolonged sense that the world was becoming harder to read. Signs that had once been reliable no longer produced consistent outcomes. Land, water, wind, and sky did not respond the way they had been remembered. And when nature becomes harder to interpret, every survival decision must be made under uncertainty. In that condition, pressure did not explode into an immediate disaster. It accumulated quietly. Climate change then did not kill life with a single blow, but by slowly withdrawing the conditions that had allowed life to continue. It did not take the world away. It took away humans' ability to predict the world, and when prediction vanished, stability dissolved as well, even though no moment could be named as the beginning. What they could not yet recognize was that some changes do not allow a return, not because humans had failed, but because the climate system they depended on had crossed a threshold no one could sense by intuition. When a system crosses a threshold, it does not need to become more violent to become dangerous. It only needs to stop returning to its old state. So the climate shock was not the moment the Earth became angry. It was the moment the Earth became different. And that difference spreading widely enough and lasting long enough placed humanity in the most fragile condition in its entire history. In the next chapter, we will see that the direct consequence of this shock did not remain in the environment alone, but cut deep into the structure of humanity itself, when numbers fell, when groups dissolved, and when the survival of Homo sapiens was no longer something that could be quietly assumed. There is no single day that marks the moment humanity reached the brink of extinction. No milestone, no alarm bell, no collective memory clear enough to say, from here on, we nearly vanished. What unfolded at that time did not take the shape of an ending. It was closer to a prolonged narrowing where the space for human existence grew thinner and thinner, while life continued, but only just enough to avoid disappearing entirely. After the climate shock, the world was no longer wide enough to accommodate old ways of living. The loops that had once supported life were stretched to their limits. And as ecosystems weakened humans already living close to the edge of safety entered a phase in which every survival decision carried far more weight than before. Not because people suddenly became fragile, but because mistakes could no longer be easily repaired. Humanity did not decline all at once. The drop was uneven, scattered across space and time, and for that very reason, it was extraordinarily difficult to recognize it as a species-wide catastrophe. In some regions, groups of people continued to exist, though on a smaller scale and under harsher conditions. In other regions, life quietly disappeared, not with cries for help, not amid obvious signs of disaster, but in prolonged silence when a community simply no longer had enough people to keep going. There were no witnesses to these disappearances because no one remained to witness them. There were no clear traces because the materials of human life at that time were not designed to endure. And there were no stories passed down because the communities that had existed long enough to form collective memory dissolved before they could transmit their experience. This dissolution did not happen because of violent conflict or sudden natural calamity, but for a reason far colder. There were no longer enough conditions to maintain continuity between generations. When a community no longer has enough young people to replace those who age, when children no longer survive long enough to learn and receive memory, that community does not die in the usual sense. It fades. Skills once passed from one pair of hands to another lose their learners. Familiar paths are no longer walked. Shelters are no longer returned to. And after only 1 or 2 generations, a place that once held human life returns to silence as if no one had ever been there. As resources became scarce over long stretches, humanity entered a completely different survival state from before. This state did not encourage expansion. It forced contraction. Groups became smaller to reduce pressure on the surrounding environment. They became more flexible in movement and food choices in the organization of daily life. Yet, that very compactness also made them more vulnerable to the next disruptions. Each death was no longer merely an individual loss. It became a direct blow to the group's ability to continue existing. Long-distance exchange networks, once a way for humans to spread risk and access resources not locally available, gradually disappeared. Not because people lost the ability to communicate or cooperate, but because there was no longer any surplus to trade. When everything is scarce, no one can hold enough to share without placing themselves in danger. In that context, exchange is no longer a safe strategy. It becomes a risk no one can afford to carry. Each group, therefore, was forced to turn inward. They focused on maintaining their own lives before thinking about any connections beyond the immediate range. Social relations were compressed into the most essential bonds, family hunting partners, those who shared shelter. Any relationship that did not directly contribute to survival became a luxury in a world where every unit of energy had to be calculated with care. This contraction was not only a contraction in numbers, it was also a contraction in social vision. When groups remained isolated for long periods, the ability to imagine a larger community gradually faded. Humans no longer lived in the idea of a broad species, but in the very concrete reality of the small group they depended on each day. And when the idea of the whole disappears, the decline of humanity is not felt as a shared tragedy, but as countless small, scattered stories that never meet. It was within this fragmented condition that humanity came closest to the bottom of extinction. Not because everything collapsed at once, but because there were no longer enough connections to compensate for losses occurring everywhere. Survival continued, but only in small, isolated pockets where each group had to bear the full risk of a world-changing state. And with just one more slight shift, many of those pockets of survival could have vanished forever. In that condition, population did not collapse through mass deaths that could be easily seen. It thinned. Fewer children were born. Fewer children survived to adulthood. The distance between generations began to stretch. Continuity, instead of being assumed, became a fragile achievement dependent on many factors aligning favorably at the same time. For each individual life did not look like a world ending. It looked like a world growing stricter. Each day demanded more effort to obtain what had once been considered normal. Less food, harder shelter, longer movements with greater risk. But because life still continued, no one had reason to believe they were living through the most dangerous moment in human history. What made this period especially severe was the accumulation of small factors. One bad season could be endured. 2 bad seasons in a row could be survived. But when bad seasons became the permanent state, endurance began to reach its limit. The human body adapted to short-term fluctuations, struggled under pressures that persisted without rest. Population decline, therefore, was not the result of a single cause. It was the combined effect of many factors happening at once, each one by itself, potentially bearable, but together impossible to overcome. Prolonged malnutrition does not kill instantly. It weakens the body, slows the healing of wounds, makes it harder for children to pass through the most fragile stages of development. Illness in such conditions does not need to be new or uniquely deadly. It only needs recovery to slow down. It only needs immunity to weaken a little more, and diseases that once could have been overcome begin to leave lasting damage. Accidents, always part of survival life, became more lethal when the world no longer had enough margin to compensate. A fall, a cut, a small mistake during hunting or travel might once have been survived with the help of the group. But when food is scarce, when stored energy is nearly zero, each accident becomes a chain of consequences affecting not only the individual, but the entire group depending on them. Life is not taken in an instant. It is shortened gradually, day by day. Most dangerous of all was the disruption in caring for the next generation. When adults must spend most of their energy maintaining their own survival, protecting and raising children, work that requires time, stability, and resources becomes fragile. Fewer children are born. Fewer children survive. And every child who does not make it through childhood is not only an individual loss, but a break in the continuity of the whole community. None of these factors is strong enough on its own to cause an extinction catastrophe. But when they stack, when malnutrition makes illness more dangerous, when illness makes accidents harder to recover from, when all of it weakens the ability to care for the next generation, the safety margin of life shrinks to a dangerous thinness. In this case, catastrophe does not come from a single blow. It comes from every layer of protection being eroded at the same time. What truly makes this period worthy of being called a catastrophe is this: there was no clear escape route. No single decisive action could reverse the situation. No moment when humans could face the catastrophe because they were living inside it. Each day of existence was the result of a temporary balance between forces pulling them downward and small adjustments keeping them afloat just a little longer. And when the safety margin of life narrowed to the point that just one more slight shift, a longer bad season, a harsher wave of illness, one more disruption in the chain of care could tip everything, then human existence was no longer something that could be quietly assumed. That is the nature of this catastrophe, not destruction in a flash of light, but the moment when survival becomes a fragile possibility, hanging unguaranteed, supported by no stable structure of the world. At the level of the species, this was the moment Homo sapiens became rare on its own planet. Not rare because space had shrunk, but rare because the ability to sustain continuous life had been weakened. Human groups were scattered far apart with little capacity to reconnect. And when groups remain isolated for long periods, fragility lies not only in numbers, but in the ability to continue as a unified species. None of them knew they were living through a time when if a few more factors shifted, if climate grew a little harsher, if resources declined a little faster, the human line might have broken. No one could see that probability because no one had enough information to imagine the entire species. Each group knew only that it was trying to survive one more season. The greatest danger of this period did not lie in fear, but in the normalization of fragility. When living under prolonged scarcity, people adjust their expectations downward. Survival, instead of being the foundation, becomes the goal. And when the only goal is to make it through the day, the future naturally narrows. The world in this period did not encourage accumulation or expansion. It allowed only maintenance. Any surplus energy was rare and quickly consumed. That made leaps, technological, social, cultural, almost impossible. Humanity did not advance. It held its position barely enough to avoid falling further, and it was in this fragile standstill that humanity reached the bottom of extinction. Not through a dramatic moment, but through a cold fact. If the world had not stopped applying pressure at that time, if conditions had not gradually become more breathable in later periods, Homo sapiens might have been only a short branch in evolutionary history, rather than the planet-dominant species we are today. What is striking is that even at the edge of extinction, humans still did not know they were there. There was no sense of finality, no collective awareness of the risk of complete disappearance. Only life continuing in prolonged low-grade tension, where each day of existence was the product of a fragile balance between environment and human endurance. That absence of awareness is precisely why this period was not remembered as a catastrophe. Not because it was small, not because it was not severe enough, but because no one stood outside it to observe and name it. When humans live in a prolonged survival state, all energy is poured into existing one more day. There is no mental space to reflect no material condition to preserve memory, and no community stable enough to transmit experiences beyond a generation. When written history began, it did not begin from humanity's most dangerous moment. It began from a world that had softened from regions where climate became temporarily stable, where seasons could be predicted, where people trusted tomorrow enough to stay in one place. Writing is not born from prolonged crisis. It is born when there is surplus time, surplus food, surplus stability, enough to look back on the past instead of only reacting to the present. The first communities that learned to record lived in a different world from the world of those who had reached the bottom of extinction. They farmed raised animals, built fixed dwellings, and organized life around cycles that had become reliable enough to trust. History, therefore, opens in the context of relative recovery, not in the moment of depletion. It tells the story of what began, not of what nearly ended. The memory of the time when humanity almost vanished was buried, not because it was forbidden, and not because it was deliberately erased. It was buried for a much simpler reason no one had the means to tell it. Those who survived that fragile period had no paper, no carved stone, no storage systems. They had only short-term memory passed by word of mouth within small groups, and those memories rarely lasted more than a few generations before dissolving into the new life that followed. When the world became easier to breathe in, humans did not look back at the worst time with the desire to remember. They looked forward, They built, planted, organized, and gradually formed new origin stories. Stories explaining why the present world exists rather than why it nearly disappeared. In that process, the memory of ultimate fragility did not vanish completely, but it was compressed, distorted, and fragmented into vague feelings about a turbulent time before. History as we know it, therefore, carries a deep bias. It begins with stability and treats stability as the default state. It records the formation of society, of law, of agriculture, and civilization, but rarely turns back to ask what happened before all of that became possible. That gap is not an accidental omission. It is the trace of a period when humans were not safe enough to become storytellers of themselves. And that is why humanity's first global catastrophe does not exist in books as a clearly named chapter. It exists as a layer of silence beneath history, a layer upon which every later story could finally be written. Our existence today is not evidence that the catastrophe was too small to be remembered. On the contrary, it is evidence that it was so large that only those who survived in silence could pass through it, carrying a memory they never had the chance to speak aloud. In the next chapter, we will look at what may seem most paradoxical, not strength, not superior intelligence, but the quiet flexibility of behavior and social organization that carried humanity through this bottom of extinction and opened the next possibility of existence, fragile, but just enough for history to continue being written. When we look back on the moment humanity came closest to the edge of extinction, it is easy to ask a familiar question: who saved them? Who stood up, who led the way, who changed the fate of an entire species? But that very question reflects a distinctly modern way of seeing that searches for heroes, decisive moments, or a single act capable of reversing everything. The reality of that period left no room for such things. There is no central character in this story, because the world at that time was no longer stable enough to allow one person to rise and lead the rest. A leader only has meaning when there exists a community large enough to be led, a social structure strong enough for orders to travel, and a future clear enough for guidance to have a goal. In the period when humanity touched the bottom of extinction, none of those conditions remained. Human groups were small, scattered, constantly moving and living in a contracted state, where every decision was tied directly to immediate survival. In such a world, there was no distance necessary for centralized power to form, and there was no time for a form of leadership that could rise above the daily needs of survival. There were no leaders, because power was no longer something that could be accumulated. In a world where each person had to carry their own share of risk, life did not permit one individual to shoulder it for everyone. A skilled hunter could not command the weather. Someone with a strong sense of direction could not guarantee that the road ahead would still hold food. All knowledge was local, bound tightly to specific circumstances, and therefore could not become a compass for the entire human species. There was no salvific invention because the world did not need a single solution. What humans faced was not a problem that could be solved with a new tool or a new technique, but a prolonged state of scarcity and instability. An invention, if one existed, could only help under certain conditions in a certain place for a certain length of time. But when the climate had shifted state, when ecological loops had been broken across wide regions, no tool was powerful enough to restore the old order. Nor was there a moment when humans collectively changed direction because there was no shared direction to begin with. Each group faced a different version of the same problem. In one place, cold was the primary threat. Elsewhere, drought was what had to be confronted. Adjustments that made sense in one region could become meaningless, Shenjai dangerous in another. Change, therefore, did not unfold as a unified wave. It remained scattered, fragmented, and often meaningful only within a very narrow scope. Human survival in that context was not decided in a single day, nor could it be tied to a single decision. It was stretched across thousands of consecutive days, each one just barely enough to avoid disappearing. Each day of survival was not a victory, but a temporary condition achieved more by avoiding mistakes than by producing breakthroughs. Humans did not move forward through leaps. They held their position by not slipping further. This makes survival into a process that is almost invisible. There is no climax, no clear ending, no moment to celebrate. There is only the quiet continuation of existence where each day that passes is the result of countless small adjustments, leaving a little earlier, staying a little shorter, sharing a little less, accepting a little more risk. Seen individually, these adjustments do not look historically meaningful, but repeated long enough, they produce the only thing that mattered at the time, not disappearing. That is why this story has no hero to honor. It has only ordinary people, none of whom knew that their quiet persistence was keeping the entire species alive. And precisely because there was no moment of rescue to remember when the world gradually stabilized again, the memory of that fragile time dissolved into the background silence of history, leaving behind a simple but cold truth. Humanity did not survive through a miracle, but through the relentless avoidance of the worst miracle of all, complete disappearance. In a world that has changed state, where every safety margin has narrowed to dangerous thinness, large actions often carry risks that are too high. A wrong decision is no longer a lesson. It can be the end of an entire group. Humans, therefore, did not advance through leaps. They advanced through extremely small adjustments, so small no one named them yet, enough to make the difference between continuing to exist and vanishing. Adaptation in this context was not a strategy drawn up in the mind, still less the product of long-term calculation. It did not take the shape of a plan, and it was not named as a conscious choice. Adaptation was a reflex formed under the constant pressure of the environment where every behavior was tested, again and again, by the same simple but ruthless question: does this help us live through the next season? Behaviors that could not answer that question disappeared without debate, without the need for moral or cultural reasons. They simply stopped being repeated. And conversely, behaviors that allowed life to continue a little longer, however small, however imperfect, however costly, were kept. This process required no coordinator. It happened automatically through the pressure of existence itself. Adaptation, therefore, did not look like progress. It looked like relentless filtering. The groups that survived were not the strongest in the physical sense, nor were they the largest, nor the ones with the most complex organization. In an unstable world, concentrated strength and large scale often become burdens. The more people, the greater the demand. The more structure, the harder it is to change. The more tightly bound a group is to a fixed way of life, the more vulnerable it becomes when the environment can no longer support that way of life. The groups that survived were the most flexible. Flexible first in movement, willing to leave a place once considered home when signs of decline appeared, even though that meant stepping into unfamiliar lands and carrying greater risk. Flexible in diet, accepting sources of food once ignored, learning to extract more from less, and not tying identity to a single means of survival. Flexible in the organization of life, where roles were no longer rigid, and each person had to be able to take on multiple tasks depending on circumstances. Most important of all was flexibility in how strongly they clung to old patterns. The groups that survived did not defend tradition simply because it had once been right in the past. When a way of life stopped working, they let it go, even though letting go meant loss, the loss of familiarity, the loss of skills honed across generations, even the loss of the stories that had helped them understand who they were. Letting go in this case was not a spiritual failure. It was the condition for continuing to exist. That letting go did not happen easily, and it did not happen in peace. It often came with confusion, with failed experiments, with real costs paid in health and in lives. But in a world that had changed state, clinging to old patterns was far more dangerous than stepping into the unknown. Groups that could not let go, not because they were wrong, but because they could not change fast enough, gradually vanished from the current of life. What is striking is that none of the surviving groups was conscious that it was doing the right thing. They had no frame of comparison to know other groups were failing. They only knew that what they were doing had not yet caused them to disappear. And in that context, not yet disappeared was the only measure of success. Adaptation, therefore, did not produce superior humans. It produced humans flexible enough not to be eliminated. It did not reward excellence. It punished rigidity. And that silent mechanism, no heroes, no feats, no glorious moment, allowed humanity to keep its fragile presence on the planet long enough for the world to become more breathable again, and long enough for history later to begin to be written. No tradition is strong enough to keep if it threatens life. No habit is sacred enough that it cannot be changed. What endures is what can bend under pressure instead of shattering. One of the most important adaptations in this period was a shift in social scale. As the world became harsher, large groups stopped being an advantage. They consumed too many resources, placed too much pressure on the surrounding environment, and were harder to move when conditions changed. Smaller groups, by contrast, could be more flexible, leave fewer traces, and adjust behavior more easily when circumstances demanded it. This shrinking was not only a reduction in numbers, it was also a reduction in social structure. More complex roles gradually disappeared. People became more multi-skilled not because of an ideal, but because of necessity. Each individual had to carry more tasks than before, finding food, protecting the group, caring for the vulnerable, and passing on life-critical skills to the next generation, if that generation could survive long enough. Another adaptation less noticed, but decisive, was the widening of diet. When familiar food sources became unreliable, humans were forced to experiment. They ate what they had once ignored. They hunted smaller animals, slower ones, or species that were harder to access. They used more parts of a single prey animal. Not every experiment succeeded, and many real prices were paid. But that continual process of trial and error expanded the survival range of humanity in a world growing less forgiving. Adaptation also took shape in how people moved. Fixed routes could no longer be trusted absolutely. Returning to the same place year after year became a risk. Humans learned to live without long-term attachment, carrying fewer belongings and leaving fewer traces behind. Lightness in movement was not a romantic choice. It was a condition for not being trapped in an environment that was weakening. The crucial point is this: none of these adaptations was experienced as a victory. No one looked back and said, "We did it right." The adjustments were simply kept because they had not yet failed. And in a fragile world, not yet failed was a major achievement. Human survival, therefore, did not look like a heroic story. It looked like quiet endurance. There was no climactic moment, no release, only a long sequence of days in which existence was stretched a little further. This also explains why the memory of that period was not celebrated or preserved. There was nothing sufficiently dramatic to become myth. no person large enough to represent the whole species. What endured were small, scattered, anonymous behaviors, things not easily turned into a story, and it was precisely that anonymity that saved humanity. If survival had depended on a single individual or a single invention, the probability of failure would have been very high. But when survival depended on thousands of small adjustments, repeated in many different places, under many different circumstances, risk was distributed. One group could fail, but another could find a different way to live. One strategy could be ineffective in one region, yet sustain life in another. The diversity of adaptation was the last layer of insurance for humanity, not in the sense of a designed protective mechanism, but in the sense that risk was never concentrated in a single choice. When the world becomes unpredictable, any way of life can fail. But when many ways of life exist in parallel, the failure of one group does not mean the failure of the entire species. Survival, therefore, did not lie in finding the single right path, but in not placing everything on one path. Not everyone survived. In fact, many groups disappeared, and those disappearances did not look like a collective tragedy, but like small endings no one witnessed. A group could not find food through a bad season. A community lacked enough young people to continue. A migration route became impossible to return to. These endings happened in silence, leaving no trace large enough to be remembered. But life does not require everyone to exist in order to continue. It only requires enough. Enough in this context is not a safe number. It is a fragile threshold, enough groups in different places, enough individuals carrying different ways of living, enough lines of continuation, so that when one branch breaks, other branches still remain. Human continuity did not unfold as a single, unbroken straight line. It resembled a thin network where many strands snapped, but the whole net did not tear completely. That fragmentation, often read as a sign of weakness, became the condition for survival. When groups lived scattered and adapted in different ways, no single shock was powerful enough to erase all of them at once. A disruption could wipe out groups dependent on a specific ecosystem, yet affect less the groups that had adjusted differently. A climate shift could make one region unlivable, while at the same time opening survival possibilities in regions once ignored. Diversity in adaptation also meant diversity in behavior diet movement and social organization. There was no single standard by which to measure the correct way to live. Some groups endured by moving constantly, others endured by holding on to small but familiar territories. Some relied on large game hunting. Others relied on countless small sources. Each way of life was fragile, but the simultaneous existence of many ways reduced the likelihood of total disappearance. What matters is this: none of these groups knew it was playing a role in a species-level survival mechanism. They did not exist to ensure humanity. They were simply trying to live through the next season. Yet from the distance of history, that lack of coordination, lack of unity, and lack of a single shared direction became an advantage. It prevented humanity from making the same fatal mistake at once. Human survival, therefore, was not the result of a perfect collective strategy, but of a natural process of distributing risk. Risk was not managed. It was broken into smaller pieces. Failure was not avoided completely. It was limited in scope. And when one branch vanished, life did not stop. It simply moved through other branches that remained. In that fragile state, humanity kept its presence on the planet, not secure, not glorious, but continuous. Enough not to be erased. Enough that when the world gradually became easier to breathe again, the remaining branches could expand once more, carrying traces of what had been tried, what had failed, and what had survived. And because that survival had no center, no hero, no single shared story to tell, it is rarely seen as a triumph. Yet, in the entire history of human existence, there may have been no achievement more silent or more important than not disappearing at the moment when every condition stood against the continuation of life. When climate conditions softened again in later periods, the surviving groups did not step out of disaster with a sense of victory. They stepped out with behaviors sharpened under pressure. Those behaviors, flexible, cautious, economical, willing to let go, became the foundation for more stable ways of life later on. There are no heroes in this story, only ordinary people who did not give up in a world that no longer guaranteed their existence. And for that very reason, when written history began, it did not retell this period as an epic achievement. It only began to tell what came after. But without those anonymous years, without those small adjustments, there would have been no history left to write. In the next chapter, we will look at the deeper consequence of this period of adaptation, not in the environment, but inside modern humans themselves. Vague fears, survival reflexes, and ancient memories that still echo in our psychology today. When humans emerged from the most fragile period in their entire history of existence, they did not carry with them clear stories about how they had nearly disappeared. There were no chronicles, no records, no consistent legends that could say there once was a time when the life of the entire species was held together by threads so thin. But the absence of records does not mean the memory did not exist. It only existed in another form. The memory of catastrophe was not preserved in writing, because writing requires a world calm enough to stop and look back. It was not told in words because speech requires listeners who have enough time and safety to receive it. Instead, that memory was compressed into behavior, into habits repeated so often they no longer needed explanation. It survived as reflex the way people chose where to live, the way they treated food, the way they reacted to signs of instability, and the way they assessed risk even before risk had taken shape. There was no beginning to remember, no ending to close. There was only a quiet, underlying sensation that the world can change faster than we expect, and that safety, if it exists at all, is always temporary. Those reflexes did not appear as a clear fear, but as a caution that was hard to name. They led humans to prioritize backup over optimization, to choose safety over absolute efficiency, and to keep reserve options even when present conditions would allow them to let go. That is why this memory is not easily erased. It does not sit on the level of consciousness where it can be dismissed by argument. It lives on the level of action where decisions are made before reason has time to intervene. As living conditions gradually became easier to breathe within, as the climate stabilized long enough for humans to stay farm-build and accumulate, they began to form societies whose memory lasted longer than a single generation. For the first time, the past could be carried beyond one human life. But those societies were not born from zero. They stood on the foundation of reflexes sharpened during a long age of instability reflexes that had allowed their ancestors to endure when nothing guaranteed tomorrow. And so, even when the world had softened the way humans organized, life still carried traces of older fragility. They built storage before they thought about expansion. They established rules of sharing for times of scarcity, even when surplus was present. They developed rituals tied to harvest water and natural cycles, not only as belief, but as a way of maintaining a cautious relationship with an environment that had once betrayed their trust. Those reflexes did not disappear when stability became familiar. They simply changed context. From direct survival reflexes, they became cultural foundations. From individual behaviors, they were standardized into laws, customs, and social morals. Humans no longer remembered why they had to store, why they had to avoid dependence on a single source, or why they had to be wary of changes that moved too quickly. But they continued to do those things because this was a way of living that had once worked in an unforgiving world. Over time, the memory of catastrophe was frozen into social structure. It was no longer felt as memory, but as common sense. And because it became common sense, it was no longer questioned. Humans learned to live on top of it without needing to know where it came from. More stable societies, therefore, were not a denial of the fragile past, but a continuation that had been adjusted, a past still present, but hidden beneath the forms of habit rule and collective intuition. That is how an unrecorded memory continues to exist. Not as a story to retell, but as a silent, underlying force shaping the way humans see the world and see themselves, even when they believe they have entered an entirely new era. Humans continue to carry a vague vigilance within them, unattached to any specific threat. A feeling that stability can be lost, a tendency to store beyond immediate need, a reluctance toward changes that happen too fast, and a strong reaction to any sign of shortage. In a more stable world, these can look like unnecessary anxiety. But in the context of deep history, they are the legacy of a time when every mistake could become fatal. This unrecorded memory was not transmitted directly. It was not taught as a lesson. It was learned through observing and imitating. Children growing up in post-catastrophe communities were not told we once nearly disappeared, but they learned very early that food should not be wasted, that close relationships matter, and that relying on a single source always carries risk. These lessons did not need explanation. They seeped into life as something natural. Even as more complex societies began to form, with laws, religion, and origin stories, the memory of catastrophe did not vanish. It simply transformed. Many ancient legends speak of ages of chaos, great floods, seasons when the world became unrecognizable. Those stories are not exact historical records, but they carry the trace of something very real, a collective experience of the feeling that order can collapse, that the world is not always trustworthy. What is striking is that these memories are rarely told as a specific warning. They do not say this happened at that time for that reason. Instead, they exist as emotional patterns, a vague fear of excessive abundance, a respect for natural cycles, and an awareness that humans do not fully control the environment they depend on. This is not knowledge in the modern sense. It is memory embodied as intuition. When written history began, humans gained for the first time the ability to fix memory into material clay, stone, bone paper. But what was fixed was not the full range of human experience. Writing emerged under very specific conditions when society was stable enough to stay in one place, abundant enough to divide labor, and orderly enough to feel that the surrounding world could be described, managed, and controlled. And so what was recorded was often the evidence of stability harvests, stores, laws, borders, lineages, and victories. The periods when that order did not yet exist or had once fallen apart rarely became the object of record, not because they were unimportant, but because they did not fit the spiritual and political needs of a society trying to assert that the present order was rational, durable, and trustworthy. From the beginning, written history carried a hidden purpose to reassure humans that the world operates by graspable rules, that what exists has a foundation and origin, and a reason to continue. To recall a period when every structure was fragile, when survival was not guaranteed, would weaken that message. It would raise a dangerous question: if the world once nearly collapsed, what guarantees it will not collapse again? And so history was written not to remind people of fragility, but to cover it with a continuous story of order progress and the rationality of the present. Yet not writing it down did not mean the memory of catastrophe disappeared from social life. On the contrary, it sank deep into the way humans organized their lives. Backup structures appeared very early in stable societies. Grain stores, distribution systems for times of shortage, rules about sharing and support when harvests failed. These structures were not merely technical solutions. They were collective reflexes turned into institutions, traces of a time when survival depended entirely on preparing for the worst. Rituals for harvest, for rain, or for the balance of nature carry the same origin. They do not only reflect religious belief, they are also a way of maintaining a sense of connection to a world that had once been difficult to predict. In such rituals, nature is not treated as a default stable system, but as something that must be soothed, respected, and approached with caution. This shows that the memory of deep instability remained present even when daily life had become safer. Rules about sharing during scarcity are another clear expression of catastrophe memory frozen into society. In many cultures, hoarding too much or refusing help when the community suffers is seen as dangerous not only morally, but in terms of survival. Such rules do not come from abstract generosity. They come from a real experience when shortage lasts. Selfishness can break the ability of an entire group to continue. Even when the worst no longer happens, often the reflex to prepare for it remains. Humans keep building storage, keep maintaining reserves, keep making rules for crisis, even during prosperity. These behaviors are sometimes viewed as conservative, as lacking faith in the future. But from the depth of history, they are a rational continuation of a collective memory, formed in a time when optimism could become a fatal mistake. And so written history and catastrophe memory do not exist separately. One tells a story of order so humans can live quietly in the present. The other continues silently to remind them that order is not self-evident. And it is precisely the tension between these two layers of memory, one written, one lived, that has shaped the way humans build societies, always moving toward stability, but never fully forgetting that stability can be lost. On the level of the individual, this memory appears as a nameless unease, a tendency to worry ahead, a strong reaction to the possibility of insecurity, even when that possibility is only hypothetical. These feelings are not a flaw in modern humans. They are the product of tens of thousands of years living in a world where stability was never guaranteed for long. The human brain is not designed to forget deep survival lessons simply because the outer conditions have changed. This also explains why humans often react strongly to signs of crisis, even before they become real catastrophes. Rumors of shortage, small disruptions in supply chains, or short-term climate fluctuations can trigger very ancient reflexes: hoarding, contracting inward, and seeking safety in smaller groups. These reflexes are not irrational panic. They are the deep memory of a species that once lived at the edge of disappearance. Unrecorded memory, therefore, does not live in books, nor does it require libraries or stone monuments to survive. It lives in the way humans respond to the world before they have time to name what is happening. It appears in decisions that seem modern, whether to store or spend, to trust or doubt, to expand or hold back, yet are guided by very old instincts formed in a time when stability was never assured for long. Modern humans may live in cities, rely on technology, and believe they have escaped the fragile world of their ancestors. But with only a small sign of instability, the old reflexes rise immediately. News of supply disruptions makes people stockpile. Climate anomalies make them worry beyond the immediate impact. Rapid changes in social order awaken the need to retreat into small, familiar circles where safety can be restored. These responses do not need to be taught. They happen before reason can intervene. That is behavioral memory speaking. Those instincts do not speak in a clear language. They do not tell us there was once a time when humanity nearly vanished. They only whisper again and again that stability is fragile, that what runs smoothly today can slip off course tomorrow, that we should not place all trust in a single source, a single structure, or a single assumption about the future. That is why, even in the most tightly organized societies, humans keep non-optimal behaviors if judged by modern standards. They prepare more than necessary. They hold on to older habits, even when more efficient solutions exist. They react strongly to potential risks, even when the probability is low. Such behaviors are sometimes labeled conservative, anxious, or lacking in trust. But from an evolutionary depth, they are traces of a collective memory forged in a time when one mistake could end continuation itself. What is notable is that these instincts do not disappear when humans understand the world better. Even when science offers explanations, even when data shows a risk is controlled, the underlying unease remains. Because this memory is not information. It is reflex. It does not need to be persuaded. It only needs to be triggered. And because it operates on such a deep level, this unrecorded memory is both burden and inheritance. It can make humans worry too much during stable times, but it is also the reason humans rarely ever fully abandon preparation. It keeps them spending part of their energy on the worst-case scenario, even when the best-case scenario is unfolding. In that way, the memory of the ancient catastrophe still lives with us, not as a story to retell, but as a whisper that continuously reminds. It does not say the world will collapse. It only says the world once almost did, and therefore the stability we have should never be treated as self-evident. Perhaps that is the most durable form of remembering humanity ever created. Not dependent on writing, not dependent on legend, but dependent on the way we choose, hesitate, and prepare every day for a future that deep down we always know could change very quickly. In the end, what matters is not whether the memory of catastrophe is retold, but that it helped humanity become a species that prepares for uncertainty. That preparation, sometimes excessive, sometimes unnecessary, has allowed humans to continue existing in a world that was never completely safe. And perhaps that is the deepest form of remembering. Not in words, not in symbols, but by letting a life or death experience shape the way we exist, even when we no longer remember why we exist that way. In the next chapter, we will close this journey by looking back at the greatest paradox of all humanity's first global catastrophe was forgotten in written history, yet became inseparable from the way humans live, think, and respond to the world down to the present day. When we look back across the entire journey of humankind, a paradox becomes unmistakably clear. The most dangerous, most fragile, most decisive periods for our existence are also the periods least remembered. History in the sense of writing dates and recorded events does not begin at the moment humanity nearly vanished. It begins afterward when the danger has retreated just far enough for people to breathe evenly, look back and tell their story. This is not a coincidence. It reflects the nature of history itself, and it reflects the conditions required for history to exist. History cannot be written while survival is being threatened day after day. It requires distance from death, from shortage, from uncertainty. When all energy must be poured into staying alive, There is no room left to record, to reflect, or to organize memory into narrative. History, therefore, is not born in prolonged catastrophe. It is born when catastrophe has passed, or at least when it has temporarily quieted. After deep climatic upheavals and the period when humanity reached the lowest edge of extinction, the world gradually entered intervals of relative stability. Not absolute safety, but steadiness sufficient for people to predict tomorrow. Seasons began to hold rhythm. Land began to allow repeated cultivation. Water sources no longer changed with total unpredictability. It was within these intervals of stability that humans, for the first time, could remain in one place long enough to accumulate food tools and, most importantly, memory beyond a single lifetime. At its deepest level, history is a product of surplus. Surplus time to record. Surplus energy to reflect. Surplus stability to believe that what's written down today will still matter tomorrow. Without those conditions, writing cannot endure as a system. It would have nowhere to be stored, no community stable enough to receive it, and no confidence that remembering the past is a worthwhile investment. So, when history begins, it begins in a world that has passed the critical danger. And for that very reason, history carries a bias from the moment of its birth. It tells stories of order formation, progress, and expansion. It rarely turns back to the phases when that order did not yet exist, or when it had once broken apart. Not because those phases were unimportant, but because they do not fit the needs of a society trying to affirm that the present world is rational and durable. In this sense, history is not a complete record of human experience. It is a record of what can be told under stable conditions when people have time to look back language to describe, and the belief that remembering the past is worth doing. What cannot be told not because it lacks importance, but because it lacked the conditions to survive, as a story gradually gets pushed to the margins of written memory. Those are the years lived at the edge of disappearance, when all energy was pulled into maintaining life and memory, existed only in the short range of behavior and reflex. This historical void is not a specific period that can be marked neatly on a timeline. It is a long, blurred zone where events are not arranged into sequence, where cause and effect are not named, and where human experience is not fixed into symbols. In that void, life continues but leaves no narrative. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened could not become history in the traditional sense. Those years had no global witnesses. Each group experienced only a tiny fragment of the larger picture, with no way to connect those scattered pieces into a shared story. There was no center to gather memory. No social structure stable enough to transmit experience beyond 1 or 2 generations, and no abstract language developed enough to describe processes that were slow, extended, and yet decisive. When history was later written, it looked out at a world that had already changed. The communities stable enough to record did not live in the conditions that produced that void. And so they did not merely lack sources, they lacked the lived experience needed to ask the right questions. What lay outside their memory did not appear as something requiring explanation. The historical void, therefore, was not felt as a deficiency, but as a natural feature of the distant past. That produces a lasting illusion that human history is a continuous sequence of formation and expansion, punctuated only by short-term disruptions. The gaps between milestones are filled with an assumption of prolonged normalcy. But reality may be the opposite. Stability is rare, and long stretches of instability were the baseline condition of human existence for most of our time. What has no voice in chronicles does not therefore disappear from reality. It remains as the invisible boundary of written history. It reminds us that every recorded order was built upon the foundation of unrecorded experience. Every society with long memory stands on the shoulders of generations who had no ability to tell stories about themselves. This historical void also imposes a limit on how we understand the past. It forces us to admit that there are things that shaped humankind which can never be fully reconstructed through data or text. The periods lived at the edge of disappearance left no precise dates, no names, no direct narration. And yet those periods sharpened reflexes, social structures, and intuitions that still remain today. So, when we say those years have no voice in history, that does not mean they had no influence. On the contrary, their influence runs so deep, it does not require a voice. They became the invisible ground beneath every story, later told, a ground written history rarely looks down upon, yet always stands upon. Recognizing this historical void does not make history meaningless. It makes history more humble. It reminds us that what we know is only the surface of a far deeper human experience, in which life was once preserved in silence, not through storytelling, but through continuing to exist when there was nothing left to hold on to except the ability not to disappear. This also explains why the earliest writing societies often focused on recording harvests, storage laws, and lineages. Those were not merely administrative facts. They were implicit declarations that order had been established, that continuity had been secured, that the world, at least within that community, had become reliable enough to be managed and described. But just beneath the surface of those records, the memory of catastrophe still remained. It did not appear as a chapter in a book, but as a background obsession that made people intensely concerned with reserve storage and risk control. Large granaries did not only reflect abundance, they reflected fear of shortage. Strict rules for sharing in hard times were not only morality, they were survival reflexes turned into institutions. History, therefore, is both a product of stability and an effort to preserve that stability against the deep memory of how easily it can collapse. It tells the story of order to reassure people, while beneath it, ancient reflexes still whisper that order is never self-evident. Another paradox emerges here as well. Precisely because the catastrophe was so vast, so prolonged, and so fragmented, it could not become history in the traditional sense. There was no clear ending to mark, no global witness to retell it, no community large enough and stable enough to preserve it as a unified story. Humanity's first global catastrophe therefore has no date. It has only a long period, fading, blurring, dissolving into the background of time. When history began, humans did not write, "We once nearly vanished." They wrote, "This is how we organize the world." That choice was not deliberate avoidance. It was the natural outcome of a much deeper need, the need to believe the present world can stand. By recording laws, structures, harvest lineages, and victories, humans asserted that order not only exists, but can be understood, maintained, and transmitted. In that process, the memory of catastrophe did not disappear, but it was covered over. It retreated from direct narration and continued to live in another form, in the very structures history describes as obvious. Laws were not only for governing society, they were for preventing the dissolution that haunted collective memory. Rituals were not only to honor gods or nature, they were to maintain a cautious connection with forces that had once exceeded human control. And society's response to instability, tightening, quickly preparing, restoring order, was not only political or economic behavior, but ancient reflex awakened. From the present, this forces us to ask an uncomfortable but necessary question: is what we call normal truly the default state of the world? Or is normal simply the name humans give to intervals calm enough for them to forget how fragile existence is? When history is written mostly in stable periods, it becomes easy to confuse temporary conditions with the enduring nature of reality. Perhaps what we call order is not a permanent foundation, but a delicate equilibrium achieved only when countless conditions align at once. Climate steady enough, resources resilient enough, and social structures flexible enough. When those conditions coexist, history can be written as a coherent narrative. But when even a few of them shift order, can dissolve far faster than writing can remember. And that is why the deepest reason history begins after catastrophe is not that humans forgot the past, but that humans needed a story in order to go on living. Believing the present has a solid foundation gives people the courage to invest in the future, to build, to have children, to remain in one place. If the past were told as an unbroken chain of fragility, if existence were understood as a rare luck that could vanish at any moment, the drive to maintain society would weaken. In that role, history is not only the recording of the past, it is a collective psychological tool. It softens the vague fear that the world can collapse. It turns survival into something assumed rather than a rare miracle. And by doing so, it allows people to live calmly in the present, not because the present is absolutely safe, but because belief in order lets them act as if it is. But even as history performs that reassuring work, the memory of catastrophe does not vanish. It remains at the edge of awareness, reminding us that order is not a default right, but a state that must be maintained. It makes humans both build and remain wary, both trust and prepare for the possibility that everything could change. And in the tension between belief and caution, history continues to be written not as proof the world is unchanging, but as evidence that humans once learned how to live quietly after passing through the worst. Seen this way, history did not begin despite catastrophe. It began because catastrophe had receded just far enough. It is the story of those who remained written at the moment they were safe enough to believe someone would read it. And that belief, however fragile, became the foundation for the present world to continue day after day within an order we call normal. But once we understand that history begins only after danger has retreated, we also recognize its limits. History does not tell the whole story of humankind. It tells the part humans were safe enough to tell. The rest, what happened when safety did not yet exist, was preserved in other forms: behavior, reflex, intuition, and the vague fear that everything can change faster than we expect. So when we ask, why does history begin after catastrophe? The answer is not that humans forgot the past, but that humans can only tell stories after they have survived the worst. History is the whisper of those who remained written in the moment they were stable enough to believe that whisper would not be carried away by the wind. And perhaps what matters most in this chapter is not a conclusion, but a different way of seeing history. Not as a continuous line of progress, but as a thin layer of stability laid over a very deep ground of fragility. A ground humankind once crossed in silence and still carries, even if it no longer remembers in words. When entering the modern world, humans often believe they have left their primal fears behind. Cities have light all night long. Food stores no longer depend on the seasons. Medicine can intervene when the body is in danger. Everything seems designed to erase the sense of fragility that once covered the lives of our ancestors. But even if the surface has changed profoundly, one thing remains unchanged: the feeling that order can be lost. That fear no longer takes the shape of predators stalking in the dark, or of winters so long they drain every source of life. It does not stand in front of us where it can be seen. It does not make a sound that can be recognized, and it has no name clear enough for people to point at and say that is what is threatening us. Instead, it dissolves into the background of everyday life, existing as a layer of vague anxiety, a low, persistent tension that continues even when every objective measure suggests that life is stable, safe, and under control. In that state, modern people may not feel panic, but they rarely feel completely relaxed. They may not know what specifically they are afraid of, yet they still feel the need to prepare for a possibility that has not happened, to prepare for a risk that has not taken shape, to prepare simply because it feels as though not preparing is what is dangerous. Fear here does not drive urgent action. It creates a posture of existence, a background vigilance that does not require a clear reason to be maintained. This is not a paradox of modern life. It is a direct consequence of the deep memory humankind carries from the eras when we lived at the edge of disappearance. When a species exists long enough under conditions where stability is never guaranteed, its brain is not shaped to fully trust peace, no matter how many generations that peace may last. Instead of learning how to relax when things are temporarily calm, it learns to distrust that calm itself. In ancient times, when a single failed season or a small climatic shift could lead to irreversible consequences, vigilance was not a choice. It was the condition of continuing to exist. The brain was rewarded not when it was right about safety, but when it was right about danger. Missing a risk once could end an entire line of continuation. Meanwhile, being excessively vigilant rarely produced severe consequences. Across thousands of generations, this asymmetry shaped a nervous system that treats worry as the default and treats peace as only an interval. When we step into the modern world, that structure does not disappear. It only loses its direct object. There are no longer predators to avoid, no longer winters to fear in concrete ways, but the vigilance system remains active. It continues to search for signs of instability, continues to detect small deviations in order, and continues to trigger the feeling that we must prepare even when the threat exists only in abstract form. That is why modern humans can live in conditions that have never been materially safer, and still carry the feeling that safety must be protected without pause. They may not know what is coming, but they believe something could come. And that belief does not need proof in order to exist. It is sustained by an evolutionary memory deeper than any present-day data, a memory formed, not from what was recorded, but from what once nearly caused our species to disappear. In that sense, ancient fear is not an obsolete relic inside the modern mind. It is a structure still operating, still whispering, that stability is not the world's natural and permanent state. And even if we do not notice it, that whisper is still shaping how we prepare, how we worry, and how we exist each day in a world whose surface seems far more solid than anything our ancestors ever knew. In modern people, that ancient fear rarely appears as explosive panic. It appears as preparation beyond what is necessary, as the tendency to stockpile more than immediate needs require, as a strong reaction to even very small signs of instability, as the feeling that if we do not prepare now, tomorrow may be too late. These reflexes do not require a specific reason. They are triggered by the possibility of instability, not by instability that has already occurred. Ancient fear also appears in the way humans evaluate risk. We often worry more about scenarios that are unlikely but catastrophic than about dangers that are frequent but familiar. This is not a failure of reason. It is the legacy of an era when a single rare event could erase an entire community. When collective memory was shaped by small deviations that led to irreversible outcomes, the brain learned to prioritize avoiding catastrophe rather than maximizing benefit. This also explains why people often react strongly to sudden shifts in social order. When the rhythm of life is disrupted, when familiar systems malfunction, fear does not focus only on the immediate problem. It awakens a deeper memory that order once collapsed not in personal recollection, but in the evolutionary memory of the species. A memory without dates, without names, yet leaving unmistakable traces in the way humans respond to instability. In those moments, people are not only protecting present interests, such as jobs, property, or social status. They are responding to an existential threat, the worry that what keeps the world functioning could dissolve faster than they can adapt the way their ancestors once experienced, even though it was never written down. This reaction often exceeds what would seem reasonable if we judged only the specific situation. A small disruption can provoke a large response because it is not processed as an isolated incident, but as a warning signal. The brain does not ask whether this disruption is serious. It asks whether this could be the first sign of a chain of collapse. And once that question is activated, ancient fear immediately takes control, pushing people to act quickly defensively, and sometimes extremely, not because they misjudge the present, but because they refuse to underestimate the future. That ancient fear also shapes the way people seek safety in small groups. Even while living in large societies with complex systems when faced with instability, humans often retreat to familiar circles, family, nearby community people like themselves, in culture, belief, or lifestyle. This is not merely an emotional, social reaction. It is a survival strategy sharpened over a very long time when life depended on direct bonds, where support did not require waiting for systems to function, did not require intermediaries, and did not require abstract trust in distant structures. In the ancient world, the small group was the only unit that could guarantee immediate continuity. Food was shared within a narrow circle. Protection came from those nearby. Information traveled through direct experience. When instability arrived, returning to the small group was not an option, it was reflex. And that reflex remains fully intact in the modern mind, even if the context has changed profoundly. That is why it is not accidental that popular culture, especially American film and television, returns again and again to stories of collapsing order and retreat into small groups. Works like The Walking Dead do not merely tell a disaster story. They focus on how humans restructure life around small communities after larger systems fail. The fascination is not zombies. It is the ancient question beneath them: who belongs to our group and who does not. Similarly, films like Contagion draw on fear of the invisible, not an enemy with a face, but the breakdown of trust in familiar order. American audiences are pulled in not only by scientific plausibility, but because the story touches something deeply real. When systems begin to wobble, people immediately try to protect family resources and their circle of safety first. Even in high-action works like Mad Max Fury Road, the post-collapse world is built around small groups, scarce resources, and mutual suspicion. That is not pure fantasy. It is a symbolic reenactment of a fear that was once very real in human history. When order disappears, life returns to a primal state in which the small group is the final unit of existence. The lasting popularity of these themes shows that ancient fear does not live only in individual subconscious, but also in collective imagination. Popular culture becomes the place where modern humans rehearse collapse, not because they want it to happen, but because something deep within them still wants to know if order disappears, who will we belong to, and who will belong to us, alongside stories of social collapse and apocalypse. American cinema is also especially drawn to large-scale natural disasters where the enemy has no mind, no motive, and cannot be negotiated with. That is precisely what makes these stories reach deeper into the oldest fear of all nature, can shift state, and humans are not the center of the world. Films like The Day After Tomorrow directly exploit the obsession with sudden climate reversal, ice flooding south within days, shattering the assumption that climate changes slowly and predictably. What leaves a strong impression on American audiences is not only spectacle, but a deeply familiar feeling. At a deeper level, the world once ran steadily, and then suddenly it did not. Similarly, 2012 pushes that fear to its maximum through a scenario of total planetary instability. Even with its entertainment-driven exaggeration, the film still revolves around an ancient reflex when the physical foundation of the world collapses. Land-splitting seas, rising volcanoes, awakening every social structure becomes secondary, and life returns to the smallest units, family survivor groups, and the instinct to protect loved ones. In that way, stories that seem very modern are touching instincts that are very old. They remind us that no matter how vast the society we live in when instability appears, we still carry the reflex of returning to the closest bonds. Not because we reject the larger world, but because at the deepest level we still remember, without being able to name it, that there was once a time when only those small circles were strong enough to keep life from disappearing. Even the attraction of apocalyptic stories in modern culture reflects that ancient fear. People are drawn to collapse scenarios not because they want the world to end, but because those stories allow them to confront a fear that has long been buried. By imagining collapse, people try to name, picture, and control a feeling that is otherwise vague, the feeling that the current order is not self-evident. What is notable is that ancient fear does not only generate anxiety, it is also the source of many constructive behaviors. Precisely because we believe stability can be lost, we invest in reserves in education, in insurance systems, and in structures designed to reduce risk. Fear in this case is not the opposite of civilization. It is one of the quiet forces that help civilization endure. However, ancient fear is not without consequence. When it operates beneath awareness, it can shape decisions in ways that no longer align with present realities. A system designed to protect against extinction-level risk does not easily recalibrate when conditions improve. What once functioned as a life-preserving reflex can, in a different context, begin to distort perception and constrain possibility. Unrecognized fear does not usually express itself as panic. More often it manifests as rigidity. People become cautious not only about threats, but about change itself. Novelty is approached as risk by default. Difference is interpreted as instability. The unknown, rather than being a space of potential, is treated as a hazard to be minimized. In this way, a survival reflex that once rewarded adaptability can paradoxically produce resistance to adaptation. This resistance is not irrational in origin. For most of human history, change was dangerous. A shift in climate migration patterns or resource availability could cascade into irreversible loss. In such conditions, skepticism toward change was not conservatism, it was prudence. Stability meant continuity, and continuity meant survival. The problem arises when that logic persists unchanged in a world where many forms of change no longer carry existential consequences. As a result, ancient fear can amplify worst-case thinking even when probabilities are low. It encourages the protection of existing structures long after their original function has faded. It favors familiar systems over potentially better ones, not because the old systems are optimal, but because they are known. The cost of transition is felt more vividly than the cost of stagnation. At the collective level, this dynamic can slow innovation, harden social boundaries, and deepen distrust during periods of uncertainty. Communities may retreat inward, prioritizing cohesion over openness, security over flexibility. These responses once preserved small groups in fragile environments. In complex modern societies, they can instead limit resilience by reducing the ability to absorb and integrate change. The tension that emerges is persistent and unresolved. Ancient instinct urges caution, consolidation, and defense. Modern conditions often require experimentation, openness, and transformation. Reason alone struggles to mediate between the two because the fear in question does not originate in logic. It is rooted in embodied memory, in neural pathways shaped by survival pressures far older than contemporary institutions. This is why appeals to data or reassurance frequently fail to dissolve unease. One can understand intellectually that a system is stable, a risk is minimal, or a change is necessary, and still feel compelled to hesitate. The fear does not need to be convinced, it needs to be acknowledged. Only when this inherited reflex is recognized as what it is, a legacy of a far more precarious past, can it be held in balance rather than allowed to dominate. Not erased, but contextualized. Not silenced, but integrated. Because the same instinct that warns against reckless confidence also becomes limiting when it is mistaken for wisdom in every circumstance. In that unresolved space between past and present, human societies continue to operate, carrying forward tools shaped by ancient danger into a world that increasingly demands a different kind of courage. Modern humans therefore live with a double reality. On one hand, we rely on complex systems built to produce stability. On the other hand, we carry the feeling that those systems can fail. That tension is not the fault of individuals or society. It is the legacy of a very long history in which survival was never guaranteed. If we look deeper, ancient fear does not demand that modern humans return to a life of anxiety. It simply reminds us that safety is not a permanent natural state, but an achievement that must be maintained. Recognizing the existence of that fear does not make life darker. On the contrary, it can make people more careful in evaluating what they have, and more humble before the fragility of order. Perhaps, most importantly, ancient fear is not the enemy of modern humans. It is an echo, a reminder that we are the result of generations who lived in conditions where a single mistake could end continuity. That echo does not ask us to panic. It asks only that we do not forget that stability, no matter how familiar, should never be treated as self-evident. And within that awareness, perhaps modern humans can find a more balanced way to live, not wholly controlled by ancient fear, but also not blindly convinced the world has permanently escaped deep upheaval. Because it was between those two extremes that humanity once survived. And it is very likely there, too, that we will continue to survive in the future. Across the entire span of human existence, catastrophe has never been rare. The climate turns, environments collapse, sources of life run dry. Events beyond human control have appeared, vanished, and appeared again, repeating in cycles far longer than any single lifetime. And yet humans are still here. Not because disasters were not terrible enough, but because people once learned how to survive under unstable conditions. What is frightening, therefore, is not the catastrophe itself. It is the moment when catastrophe has stayed distant long enough that humans begin to believe it will not return. Not because there is evidence of permanent safety, but because time has blurred the sense of urgency. When a danger does not appear within the living memory of several consecutive generations, it gradually loses its existential weight. What was once a concrete threat becomes an abstract concept, and what is abstract rarely forces human beings to act. Forgetting does not happen as a deliberate act. There is no moment when humanity collectively decides to ignore the past, and there is no resolution declaring that old lessons have lost their value. Forgetting happens slowly, quietly, and so reasonably that it becomes hard to notice. It happens in small steps, each step with its own rational justification. As new generations grow up in more stable conditions, the memory of instability gradually loses its immediacy. Not because they deny the past, but because the past no longer appears in daily life, demanding attention. As this shift takes hold, the change is subtle enough to feel natural rather than reckless. What was once understood as caution begins to look like inertia. What was once restraint begins to resemble fear of progress. Practices that evolved under pressure, saving more than needed, building redundancies. Planning for unlikely failures are no longer evaluated through the lens of survival, but through the lens of efficiency. And efficiency by its nature has little patience for safeguards, whose value only becomes visible when everything else has failed. Over time, the language surrounding these behaviors changes. Frugality is no longer framed as prudence, but as resistance to growth. Preparedness is reframed as inefficiency, resources tied up doing nothing instead of being deployed elsewhere. Vigilance is no longer associated with wisdom earned through hardship, but with anxiety, pessimism, or an inability to adapt to a modern world. The same actions remain, but their meaning is inverted. What once signaled experience now signals excess. This transformation does not happen because people suddenly stop caring about survival. It happens because survival itself begins to feel guaranteed. When daily life no longer demands constant risk assessment, when food arrives reliably, systems function predictably, and crises appear manageable or distant. The emotional logic that once justified redundancy weakens. The question quietly shifts from, what if things go wrong, to, why are we still preparing for something that never seems to happen? Backup structures suffer most under this logic. Storehouses are expensive to maintain. Support networks require coordination and ongoing commitment. Rules designed for worst-case scenarios feel overly restrictive in good times. None of these structures produce visible rewards during stability. Their success is defined by absence, by disasters that do not occur, shortages that never materialize, collapses that are quietly avoided. An absence is difficult to measure, difficult to celebrate, and easy to dismiss. As priorities move toward short-term performance growth metrics and immediate returns, these systems begin to look unjustifiable. Not because they are proven unnecessary, but because their necessity cannot be demonstrated without failure. And since failure has not happened, at least not recently, the structures designed to absorb it appear redundant. Importantly, this dismantling is almost never dramatic. No one announces that preparedness is no longer needed. No one formally declares redundancy obsolete. Instead, budgets are trimmed. Storage capacity is reduced. Maintenance is postponed. Emergency rules are relaxed temporarily. Each decision is defensible on its own, framed as rational optimization rather than risk-taking. The system is not destroyed. It is slowly hollowed out. And as this process continues, belief quietly replaces infrastructure. Confidence takes the place of contingency. Trust in stability substitutes for preparation against disruption. The assumption that the world has become fundamentally safer becomes the invisible foundation upon which decisions are made, an assumption rarely stated aloud, but embedded in every choice to cut, streamline, or simplify. What makes this moment especially fragile is that nothing appears to be wrong. Life continues to function. Growth may even accelerate. The absence of immediate consequences reinforces the belief that the old safeguards truly were unnecessary. And so the erosion continues, not driven by ignorance or malice, but by a reasonable faith that the conditions which once required caution no longer apply, until of course they do again. And it is precisely through that process of rationalization that the vigilance which once kept humanity from disappearing begins to be treated as unnecessary worry. Warnings become hard to hear, not because they are wrong, but because they no longer fit the prevailing sense that everything is running smoothly. When most of a lifetime is experienced under stable conditions, the ability to imagine collapse becomes unfamiliar, not impossible to think about, but no longer something the intuition can truly feel. At this point, catastrophe is no longer remembered as a realistic possibility. It is pushed out of the realm of what can happen and moved into the realm of what once happened, a realm of memory, with little influence on present decisions. It survives only as a distant story, retold in books, in legends, or in vague reminders too weak to change behavior. And in many cases, even that story gradually fades, reduced, softened, or told in ways that diminish its severity. The danger of this moment is not that people forget the details of the past, but that they forget the feeling the past once carried. When memory is no longer bound to the sensation of fragility, it loses its warning function. The past becomes information rather than experience. And information, no matter how accurate, rarely has the power to replace experience in shaping survival reflexes. So, forgetting does not create a sense of unease. It creates a false sense of reassurance, a feeling that the worst belongs to another world, another time, and no longer directly concerns the present. That reassurance is precisely what makes a society vulnerable, not because it makes people weaker, but because it makes them stop preparing for scenarios that were once very real in the history of human existence. And when catastrophe returns, if it returns, what makes it devastating is not only its power, but the void that forgetting has left in the way humans see the world. Dangerous forgetting is not dangerous because it erases memory, but because it changes how people interpret the present. When the fragile past is covered over the present, begins to be treated as the world's default state. Order is no longer seen as an achievement that must be maintained, but as something self-evident. Stability is no longer a temporary condition, but becomes a foundation assumed to be durable. In that state, people do not prepare for catastrophe, not because they deny risk, but because risk no longer lives inside collective intuition. When a society believes the world is inherently stable, every unusual sign is treated as an exception. And exceptions, by definition, do not require fundamental changes to the basic structure of life. This is the most dangerous moment, because history shows that major catastrophes rarely arrive as a single shock. They often come as a chain of small deviations accumulating over time, stretching across generations. When the memory of fragility has faded, people lose the ability to recognize those small deviations as warning signals. What once would have been treated as signs of instability becomes normalized. And by the time consequences become obvious, the margin of safety has already narrowed to the point where there is no room left to adjust. In this case, forgetting does not make people weaker in body or mind. It makes them lose the correct sense of risk. And that is a loss far more dangerous than lacking tools or lacking knowledge. A society that does not remember its own fragility will build as if that fragility does not exist. It will optimize for short-term efficiency rather than long-term resilience. It will prioritize growth over preparedness. It will cut away unnecessary structures. Storehouses support networks' fallback options because they do not produce immediate benefits in a world assumed to be stable. Meanwhile, the structures that helped humans survive in the past were not designed to generate rapid prosperity. They were designed to reduce risk under the worst scenarios. When memory of those scenarios fades, these structures become difficult to defend, politically, economically, and psychologically. Forgetting, therefore, does not destroy a society in a moment. It erodes resilience little by little. Even more concerning is that forgetting often comes with a false sense of control. As science, technology, and management systems become more complex, people are tempted to believe they have overcome the limits that once bound their ancestors. But understanding is not the same as invulnerability. History has repeatedly shown that the ability to predict does not eliminate risk. It only changes how risk appears. When the memory of catastrophe is pushed out of awareness, people begin to treat stability as a right rather than as a condition that must be protected. And in that moment, they become most vulnerable, not because they lack capability, but because they lack humility before the world's fragility. But forgetting is not an unavoidable fate. Unwritten memories are still there in reflexes, in vague unease, in the feeling that everything can change faster than we expect. The problem is not eliminating ancient fear, but learning to listen to it without being ruled by it. That fear does not demand that people live in panic. It only reminds us that stability is not self-evident. If there is one deep lesson from the first global catastrophe humanity survived, it is not how to avoid all risk that is impossible. The lesson is how to live with uncertainty without losing the capacity to prepare. How to build a society not only for the good years, but also for the worst scenarios, even if they may not occur for many generations. History seen this way is no longer a story of victory or continuous progress. It becomes a reminder of limits, and keeping that reminder from being forgotten even quietly may be the most important thing humanity must do in order to continue existing. Because catastrophe may come from outside, but forgetting always comes from within. And if there is anything truly more frightening than catastrophe itself, it is the moment humans believe they no longer need to remember. As this story slowly comes to a close, perhaps what lingers is not the image of any single disaster, not ice, not drought, not the cold numbers in a data table, but a truth that is deeply human, that our history did not begin with stability, but began after survival. The first lines ever written appeared only when the world had grown quiet again, when seasons could be predicted, when water returned in cycles, when people dared to remain in one place long enough to believe that tomorrow would not undo everything. The first global catastrophe of humanity, therefore, was not recorded in writing. It was recorded in existence itself, in the fact that we are still here, in the fact that the human line was not broken, in the fact that at one extremely fragile moment in the past, there were enough people who adapted rather than trying to preserve the old world at any cost. Perhaps that is why somewhere deep in the human mind, modern people still carry a fear that is difficult to name, a fear that order is not guaranteed, that stability can disappear, and that history is not a straight line upward, but a series of moments that simply have not collapsed yet. If you are listening to this story late at night, when everything around you has grown quiet, remember this. You are not just someone listening to history. You are a descendant of people who once survived a world that was no longer the same. And perhaps the most important thing that catastrophe left behind was not fear, but a quiet reminder that the existence of humanity has never been guaranteed. If this story made you slow down for a moment, if it made you look at the present world with different eyes, you can leave a comment below. It doesn't have to be long. Just tell me where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. Wishing you a good night's sleep.